So we thought we'd start off. All these people were just a little, because you don't know my work in all probability, so just a little run through of some of it, going back to the beginning, sort of beginning. And yes, I'm totally immersed in my memoir, so if I wander off, just sort of pull me back, because I'm really immersed in all kinds of feeling states that are brought up by that. But when Anya approached me and said, come and talk, be invited to come and talk about research methods, I thought, oh, how interesting. I've never thought of myself, or I haven't for quite a while thought of myself as somebody who could address that. And so I had to dip back into what methods would I say that I've ever done, and I realized, oh, of course I have research methods. And they pertain to being an activist and also a poet. When I was 16, I decided to be a poet-philosopher as my life course, and just took off from there. And just to run the history down just a little bit before we do the books. I was coming out of a sub-working class environment with severely wounded parents in a tiny little town in the south of New Mexico. And when I tried to get a job that paid me 50 cents an hour, it wasn't enough for 3 meals a day. It wasn't enough to turn the lights on. I could get a roof over my head, but I had to choose. Was I cold and in the dark and hungry, or was I out on the street and eating? And so I joined the Air Force. And I had been out to myself as a lesbian, first at the age of 12. Then I read psychology, and they said it was a phase. So I waited. At 16, I came out to myself again. Oh, it's not a phase. So I knew I was a lesbian when I went in, but I just had no idea that the entire state would collapse down onto my head. And in 1960, and at the age of 20, that I would be arrested by trench coat guys and interrogated and forced into a confession of sexual acts. It was very pornographic on their part, and that they would, when all I wanted to do was go to college, which would have cost $5,000. They spent $100,000 interrogating me, destroying everyone I knew, you know, traveling to go visit my parents 2,000 miles away and tell them what a bad person I was. And all of this stuff that was so unnecessary. It was just so ridiculous. And to top it off, it was run by gay people. It was like middle management, that's who it was. It was like so hypocritical. So I bounced out of that, you know, very wound up type, which is really good for an artist. You want that, because then you just really go through your life. But I came out of it wanting to know, how was I going to be a poet? How was I going to be useful in the world? Why had all this stuff happened to me? And where do I go from there? And among the many interesting places I went from there was Howard University, which was the only school I could afford at that time, and they generously allowed me in. They had 9,000 students, 100 were white, everyone else was African American, because that was a school established for African Americans. And that was not an era that you did that with. So I've just been trying to write up, you know, how the white men reacted to me doing this, including the taxi driver almost wouldn't take me there. He was certain I was going to be attacked the moment I set foot on the canvas. But because I'd been a lesbian and had been treated in all these different ways, I knew that they were completely wrong, because that's exactly what people were saying about me. So I had this experiential method of approaching and making decisions about my life. And fortunately for me, I went to Howard, and what a privilege that was. And I learned then a marvelous method, which I want to talk more about today, called participant observation. A perfect method for all kinds of healers, including artist healers. So I would like to talk a little bit about that, and how that came about. And I may as well do it now. One of the professors that I had at Howard is Dr. Nathan Hare, who you may have heard of because he founded the Black Scholar and edited for a long, long time with his very lovely wife. And they focused a lot on issues pertaining to the black family. When he was a young, hot-headed professor at Howard, when I knew him, he wanted to study boxers as a sociologist. And it was sociology that I was taking, because I thought, as an artist, I don't have any content. I had studied poetry as a kid, but what was I going to write about? People. Well, I needed to know about people. So I took sociology, and Nathan Hare became a boxer. He was using participant observation. And that is to say, he was keeping notes and his mind free to do all kinds of observations of various kinds. But instead of being an outsider, he actually literally turned himself into a boxer. So his boss, the head of the department, these are just such formal people, went to sit in the front row because he loved boxing. And there was his professor in the ring, in the boxer shorts. So that was a scandal. And that's one reason that I remember it, is because it was so scandalous and it was so daring. And I thought that it was so brilliant. I thought it was so amazing, such an amazing way to get to know people, which was my big ambition in life, was to find ways to get to know people different from myself. So that was an object lesson for me, that one could do that you could engage in a way with a group of people by doing what they do and listening to them and paying attention to them. So that was that method. And from there, I went to, I was a very not good person. I was trying to follow all the rules, sort of. And then I had a remarkable experience of falling ill with encephalitis, and I was in a coma for 3 days, not expected to live, not expected to recover, not expected to be a person. And I recovered my vocabulary only very gradually, and I gave up my occupation. I had been a medical lab technician before that. And now I came out of my coma fearless. I don't know what happened to me in that coma, but I came out of it fearless. I came out of it happy. At first I couldn't talk, but I could sing. And I was singing lines that a poet had written from a play called J.B. that was about, it was an apocalyptic play, Archibald MacLeish. And the song was, I love Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, la la la, very happy little melody. And I was emotionally volatile, I remember that. It was so freeing that I went out from there and told everyone that I was a poet and that I was a lesbian. So the adventure started. And it was really a grand adventure that landed me in San Francisco, co-founding a movement, being part of a revolutionary movement that we call Gay Women's Liberation. And we founded bookstores and presses and so on, really opening the portals for the burgeoning women's movement. And as women came out of their households. Really, they were coming out of feudalism, came out of low-paid jobs, came out of being called names and told that they weren't smart, and so on. We opened portals that led to an entirely different world. And we were poets at first who were, this was a leaderless movement. Couldn't be a leader, but you could be an artist. And when you were an artist, you were a revolutionary, just automatically. So that was social activism, and it was doing something that I came to understand at first as changing metaphors, changing images. And gradually, as this developed, it became changing stories and critiquing the stories that people had, were inhabiting, really. People inhabit, we inhabit our stories. They're like a house around us. We walk around with it, or a shell, if you're a turtle kind of person, or, you know, spines. Our stories surround us. So I came to understand that it was very important to change those stories. And I've been on that course now for however many years. This has been 45 or 50 years. And some of the stuff that's come out of it, I'll just show you some of the books and how they developed and talk a little bit about them. So I want to do this. This is a group of slides that Diane Jeanette put together a while ago. So in '64, when I was 24, I was, it was 65, I had the date wrong. I picketed the house, the White House, for gay rights. And those were, at that time, middle and upper class white men's gay rights. Nobody was talking about women anything at all. Nobody was talking about poor people who are LGBT. Nobody was using initials like LGBT. Everyone was gay, or fairies. And then there were lesbians. I mean, gradually we said to the men, you take the word gay, we'll keep the word lesbian. But I don't want to, I want all the words. I love the words. I use the word gay to mean both, and fairy as a positive word to mean both. So, okay, we picketed then the Gay Women's Liberation, which was so exciting. And the Women's Press Collective, we just started to produce books. And we were in San Francisco by this time. And there was already a small press movement, so it was relatively easy to do this. And then I've done all kinds of readings and performances and raised lots of money for movements, which is also a form of social activism that artists do. I think it's overlooked a little bit. Well, actually worth money. Not to ourselves. Until we're dead. To our communities. And it helps them love us, so it's okay. That's what we want, love. My work is known as feminist and women-centered, but let me just tell you, feminism is an ideology, and as an artist, I'm always having to step outside of it because it's limiting. I've reclaimed gay and lesbian and women's history in several different ways, and I take on different issues as they come up in myself and in the people I know, including my lovely students. So some things that I've done, and this was an AIDS benefit in 1985, and a lovely woman whose name I don't know is introducing me, and she introduces me as womanist, which is very interesting. So I had written pro-women work for a very long time. It's not up here yet, but we'll get to it. But you know, things like Queen of Wands and this novel and writing about Richard Stein. But to be womanist I was astounded when she said that. It was very privileged, and it really does refer to somebody, it's almost always an African-American person, a woman who is community-oriented. The whole community goes with her. It's not like feminists split from their men of necessity, because those men were oppressive in that generation. But for people in various communities, you cannot split from the men. And that's what I discovered, or rediscovered. I had always been connected to gay men. Then I was a feminist for a while, split from the men and from everybody else, then got back together with meeting with the men, and did this book, Another Mother Tongue. Wanted to tell a history of gay and lesbian people from some other point of view than the four places that we occupied at that time. As I'm not thinking of them as the four horses of the apocalypse. One was psychology, which said that we were mentally ill, and put us not only incarcerated, parents were incarcerating their children, children were having lobotomies, they were having, I forget what it's called, that thing where you're given certain shock treatments.
Shock.
Yes, but it's worse than that. It's like they'll put a picture of aversion therapy.
Right.
Yes, that was happening, and other things. So that's one. Then the second one, the police and the military, to arrest us, to come to the bars and shine lights into our faces, give us your ID, stand up here, and you don't know if they're going to put your name in the paper, and if they put your name in the paper, your professional life is over. It's done. Even if you don't serve time. And there, at that time, were plenty of people serving time, mostly men serving time. One of my friends, Paul Mariah, had served a couple of years, or maybe longer, in Illinois for a sex crime, making love to his lover. And he was a poet, so he was very outspoken and helped overturn that story about himself. Third, what was the third one? You're sinful. So you turn for solace to religion, and the answer is you get converted because you're committing sins. You give up your love. You give up your capacity to love that is so, in my view, ingrained in being gay, and pretend that you don't love. And then you can be accepted in these various tightly wound communities, and we'll give you our commendation and picnics and acceptance in the community and so on. The fourth one, you turn to revolution. You turn to revolution. You turn to how do I make social change, and you study Marxism. And what do the Marxists say? They say, you're a decadent, you're the product of capitalism and excess, and all you think about is pleasure. Hey. Let's think about pleasure for a minute. So those four were there, like just bars around all the gay people that I knew, all of us. And people were committing suicide, very depressed, very into alcohol, really being brave, trying to break through this way and that way. And some of these queens were so good at that, they were like, you know, I am what I am, honey. And you can't make me be any different. You know, and the feminists got on them saying, oh, look, you're imitating the very worst parts of being a woman. You know, it was like, please, let's not add a fifth thing to what is going on here. So Another Mother Tongue was an act of redoing an origin story. In fact, 4 origin stories. And I've just told you 4 stories that are told about gay and lesbian people. And we needed some others. So Another Mother Tongue was an exercise in that. And I started by making a list of all the bad words that I'd ever heard that we were called. And I said, I'm just going to walk right toward what those are and a look at what they might possibly mean. And they opened up and flowered and said, yeah, fairy, come on in. Let us teach you this thing and that thing. Because I have a poetic mind, I strung it together. It was not an academic piece. I hadn't even finished college yet. And I really used participant observation, which LGBT people now, the scholars, are now calling it participatory observation. They're reversing it and saying this is something you do when you're already embedded in a community and you are studying it for your own purposes. And that's what I did then. I had to leap outside of myself and look back as a prime example of what I was talking about. And what I began to be talking about, because there were people all over the world who had retained certain customs, these blessed indigenous people who have kept me sane through my whole life, who were saying, these are ceremonial offices that people have. And there was a wonderful list of them. Anything from healers and shamans to people who care for the dead, and people who become really good chiefs, or women who become warriors. And that whole book is about that. That book I wrote just in time for the AIDS epidemic. And I got such touching letters from men who felt terrible about themselves. So all of this has been heaped on them, and now there was a new story that, it's actually an old story, the Romans actually thought that we created earthquakes. You know, you're gay, you could create earthquakes. Which is very interesting that that belief remains in some of the fundamentalist preachers who say things like, see what New Orleans was? That's why Katrina came. You know, that's a story. It's an origin story. What's the origin of tornadoes? Certain kinds of sexual behavior. What is the origin of collapsing or having an illness? Being a bad person. So you can reverse that. And this book did that. It did it, and I got lots and lots of letters from people saying, you saved my life, you saved my soul, you got me through, my lover was happy when he died, he wasn't unhappy, because he had such a better sense of who he was. So I began then from that, doing it in a bigger way for women. I've been doing it for women in my poetry, with the imagery and so on, but now I began to do it for women, and I walked toward, again, one of the most underground and repressed parts of being a woman, which is menstruation, and started studying the rituals pertaining to that and putting another story together, which we're calling metaforming theory. But it's a new origin story. It really does situate entirely differently. So when I thought about this talk, I thought, okay, what I've been doing as an artist is being a healer. And what I've been healing is wounded community at its place of origin stories. And it's working. It creates happiness, confidence, totally different perspective on life to do this. It's the most marvelous work. Just amazing to do that. So I thought, okay, maybe that's of interest to all of you, because you are healers after all, and you engage with story. So this is a way to do it. So I thought, okay, I'll bring that up. Is there one more? This was the first collection. Somebody made this drawing as we were changing images. So this was mimeographed and handmade. It was all handmade at that time. And there's one more. This is a change of imagery. Show women as strong. And you know, the use of common woman. This is what I look like at the age of 35 or something. And that also was a woman-made book. And I think that's it. I think, is there Blood Red Roses? Oh yes.
Oh, yeah.
Here's what some of us look like, being tough in the country, you know, being a variety of folks, being very serious. That's about 1973 in our photographs. And that's also, we made this book, and it's a collection of stories and poems that do just what I'm talking about. They address, how do you retell a story about yourself? Another one? There's one more. Oh, this is a record I made with my co-poet, Pat Parker. We read together all the time. And we had a record put out, so that's another method that poets use to get their word out. It says, art is not a way out, there is no way out. There is only what we've got and how to turn around to reinforce our fighting genius. To clarify and point out what has been stolen from us and that we must take it back or continue with nothing. So that's the critique, but that's also the turning the story around. Okay? One more, there's one more. This is, oh yeah, there's two more. Another image, another one, there's one more. Oop. There's one more. There's one more. There's one more.
There's one more.
Forward. That's me at 33 or something. 43. There's one. Isn't there one more? There it is. Blood Red Roses. So that's the one. How menstruation created the world. See? The subtitle. How menstruation created the world. Well, how is that possible? People might ask. But that's what the book addresses, is how menstruation creates and created our reality. Okay, so we can shut this off. Thank you. And just have a discussion, I thought. We might just have a discussion about, what is wounded community, and what are origin stories that anybody knows about? I'm not sure how much time we have. We have till 3, so we've got lots of time. Okay, so that's my beginning riff. Do you have any comments? Anybody who needs to go can go now if they need to? But what's an initial impression, origin story? What is that? Yes?
I have a friend from Africa. And she's written books also, but I had asked her about gay people in her village, and she said they were referred to as gatekeepers.
Gatekeepers, yes, thank you, yes. That's right, as gatekeepers, portal keepers, shamans, and magical people. And that's actually what we are here in America as well, but it's not called that. It's called sin or whatever. We're wound up to be in opposition a lot. And yet, when I think about who opened the bookstores, who got the feminist movement out of the living rooms and into activities and into reading about people studying about themselves and learning self-defense and making films and all of the plethora of things that have happened. It's lesbians. It's just like this network that spontaneously happened as soon as we realized we could do revolutionary actions in our own behalf and act out of our own sense of what was right. And immediately we just began forming different kinds of institutions. So that's one place. This LGBT, certainly it's easy enough to see a wounded community in those groups of folks. How about women as a community? And that's, I know that's a big category. And that's a category we started with, and it has since become very multiplicitous. And would you say it's a wounded community, that there are wounded communities within that category of person? And there are wounding communities within that as well, right? You could work with Child Protective Services, for example. So those are a couple.
Judy, I have another question.
Yeah.
Before we get too far away from it, I would really like to know a little bit about your experience at Howard in terms of being lesbian. And how, because there's a, not really quite, I can't articulate an origin story among African Americans, but certainly that slight, I guess, that God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, is certainly very common, and was very common when I was young. So anyway, I just wondered about.
I had lesbian friends who were African American in Washington, D.C., and I asked them at one point, because I was doing participant observation, I asked them, who do you think dislikes gay people more, the black community or the white community? And they said, oh, the black community, just hands down, which surprised me because I had always felt safer in the black community just walking down the street. And I think it's just because the signals weren't coming across, or there was great indifference about who I was. But at that time, nobody was talking about gay, lesbian, nothing. Nobody was saying anything like that. So when I was at Howard, I was a white girl, the white working class girl. And the women, I think they saw me as a sexual rival. And there was no way that I could say, I just couldn't say, well, no. I'm not interested in the men. I'm interested in the women. There was nothing I could say. I was quite mute in that respect. But you're right in saying, and what I've also heard is that the right wing in the 90s and through the 2000s, the right wing poured a lot of money, the white right wing poured a lot of money into black churches in order to amplify divisions. That's what I've heard. I don't know if it's true or not, but it wouldn't surprise me because all of a sudden there's a lot more overt homophobia in the black community than there was when I was younger. Nathan Hare, Dr. Nathan Hare, who, whatever he may think now, at that time he was young and radical and had a gorgeous afro. He was so beautiful. He came in to class one day and he held up a magazine. He said, you all need to read this magazine. This is another group that is oppressed. And it was an underground lesbian magazine, the only one in existence, called The Ladder. You bought it at the porn stand, wrapped in brown paper, so no one would see you. But it was highly political. It was all about working for gay rights, overturning the government's not wanting to give security clearances to upper echelon scientists of various kinds and engineers and so on who were gay. But he had that, and then it turned into a book that had poetry in it, and then it became a lesbian vehicle, and then we had our movement shortly after that. But I'm just saying, that's where I first found that magazine, was from an African American professor.
But I'm sorry, was that Ladder or?
The Ladder, L-A-D-D-E-R, The Ladder. Climb up into society, gave that up. She said, we are society, what are you talking about? You find your way to us. Okay, so wounded communities and ways that art and the ways that the particular kind of research can help, and ways that understanding about story can help. So I'd like to talk about that for a minute. You know, what is people's ideas of origin stories? I thought we might even break up into groups of 3, and just, you know, what are the stories that you think people live in, or that you live in, or that you've changed in some kind of way. Is that interesting to do? Let's do that, okay. And what are wounded communities that you can think of that are of interest to you, that this might apply to, of people who are living in stories that are actually hurting them? The stories themselves are hurting them. And we don't have to go on with the same stories. Stories change. They change a lot. So count in three. Something new. So let's just, maybe I'll write on the board or something like that, but let's just have a discussion or have some testimonies of what did you learn from your discussion with each other? We've had two things to talk about. One was origin stories. I can't remember the other one. What was it?
Yeah, wounded.
Wounded communities, yeah. We did go into that. We talked about several wounded communities. And is it okay if I talk about
Yes,
what
please,
I learned
yes.
from both of you? Ross is all right. Yeah, wounded communities come in all sizes, colors, ages, genders, and so on. So how should we start this? What are some wounded communities? Let's make a list of them from the board. Some that I just heard about. One was, which one of these is the best? This is second generation.
That's invisible from
Yeah,
here.
I can't see
You
it.
can't see it.
Yep.
All right. Blue.
Blue or black.
Second, can you see it?
Yay.
Better? Second generation post-feminist men. And some of whom have formed a group called the Tribe of Men, that Ross was telling us about, to get initiated, to be initiated as a different kind of men. So it's a revision of the stories that feminism initially in its second wave was reacting to. Now it has come around, and here is a generation of men who are asking, well, if not this way to be a man, then this way of being a man, and I need to be initiated and supported in that. So that's a fabulous new movement going that really I was very impressed with. What's another one?
Our group talked about mothers and mothers, the wounded group that would be represented by mothers who take the fault or responsibility of anything that goes wrong in the family. And that one aspect is sharing the change that could happen is when self-forgiveness becomes part of the cultural norm, that we're not responsible for everyone's everything, and the mother would definitely be one of the first places to apply that tool of self-forgiveness. And I think you were sharing that self-forgiveness in her community was for everyone except the mother. And taught even in the religious dogma,
But not to apply to the mother.
Not to the mother.
And Angelina was just talking about Mother Eve as a prototype of the bad mother, the one who just could never do it right and heaped all of this sinful original sin. Talk about origin story. The word's right in there. Origin of sin. So okay. Mothers, I'm going to put mothers, Eve, and self-forgiveness. I flunked handwriting. But you know what I'm talking about there. Yes, that's a very good one. Another one?
We talked about, we had things that we talked about, but I brought up the poor.
What?
Poor people.
Poor people.
Lower classes, much maligned.
Much maligned.
Group of people. in
Poor
this
people,
culture.
they even become untouchable at some point. Have you noticed that? And you give money to homeless people and they're not sure whether you were willing to touch them or not. Like grab a hand, because sometimes that's what's wanted more than the money. So yes, the poor, very wounded in our society, not in all societies. There's some societies that they just don't do it that way, you know. It's about, okay, that's economically poor. In fact, I'm gonna put this, 24. Because my parents were poor, and oh my gosh, they were so elegant. They were so smart. We had such great times together, and I adored them. But we didn't have a car. Southern New Mexico, no car, you know. So, that, and no TV. I was so lucky. No car, no TV. Anyway, yes.
It's a group within this, the economically poor is people diagnosed with mental health diagnoses, mental illness.
Yeah. Yes.
They're very wounded community.
Yes.
And very much the same way in that with touching, they don't get touched very often either. So even within their own community, even if they're all living in a group home together, they don't touch each other. They sort of, it's, you know, so even within their own community, they don't touch each other. So.
Okay. Yes. What should we say? Just mental? People who are called, oh well, you know what that is. Mental. It's a mental problem. And we know that isn't really, what does that mean? It's just all over the map what it means. And as psychologists, that's one of the main subjects that you all work with, isn't that correct? What does that mean to be mentally ill? What does it mean to be ill? What does that condition consist of?
That's actually true of all ill people, whether it's a physical illness or a mental illness or sort of.
Yeah. Okay.
Even the word illness can be an issue.
Okay, so we'll put ill in a category. Oops, there. Speakers who trip over the chair and break their hips. Not gonna happen. Okay, those are wonderful categories. Another one, Paula?
Well, what popped in my mind is also spiritual wounding. So there are definitely spiritually wounded folks, but also the disabled. You know, when you got into the mentally, also the physically, you know, people who have chronic illnesses, whether it's chronic fatigue or a Lyme disease or back pain, chronic back pain, that type of thing. They are truly a wounded group, and they're at a low, well, they're at a low time in their lives.
Okay. So disabled. All right.
And then spiritually wounded.
Yes, that's a big one. Okay, let's take a couple more.
What we
Yes.
talked about. I was suggesting that as a heterosexual person, you can be wounded by discrimination against gay people. That is can inherently be disassociated, and that type of well, I'll say my own family, you know, was very, very, very strong messages that were anti-gay. Even if a person was gay, they still might speak out against gay people to sort of prove that they belong and they're acceptable, and that type of, you know, contradiction. But what I'm realizing through the process of really doing is like lots of self-reflection in this program is like where do my stories come from where I've been so anti-gay because of the way I was raised, and then, you know, what am I missing in my life, just being able to interact with people and have freedom and not have this sort of otherness. So that in and of itself, you know, even, you know, just as a heterosexual, you still end up being wounded by the stories that, you know, are pervasive and that keep you from aligning with people based on sexual orientation when everything else could be perfectly in alignment. It could still be a wedge.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm sure that that is why LGBTQ, and there's additional letters, but I'm gonna add one, allies. Allies. To have allies is so important. To be an ally is so important because it addresses exactly what you're talking about. And speaking from my own experience, racism wounds both sides of its divide as well. In my experience, the first people to experience racism in a racist home are the little children, where they're terrified by everything that's heaped in the name of racism, that's actually being heaped on them, and they know it at some level and grow up to be very, very fearful people. I'm not trying to compare the woundedness, but I'm saying it exists. And so with racial divides and racial categories, there's also allies. And that's a way of healing, is to be an ally in any way that we possibly can. So I'll put that one down. How shall I say this? Racism, and both sides have wounded. In other words, wounding communities can be healed also, because there are wounding communities, aren't there? There are communities expected to wound others, and they come back from those wars wounded themselves, or they live lives that are hopelessly constricted because of that. Those divides. Yes.
Yeah, that's where I was going with, you know, the whole idea of law enforcement, prison guards, military, you know, all these kinds of people really sort of serve the collective consciousness to repress what the collective doesn't want, to manage the shadow, and it does horrible things to them.
Yeah.
You know, they then live in that world of having to divide everything into good and bad, and always be on the lookout for the bad, and express violence through their bodies towards it.
So we could say even cops or soldiers, public soldiers.
I try to remember that. It's my compassion practice.
Soldiers, because especially soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and in a country that absolutely denies the horror that the country is visiting upon these peoples, and then the men and women who actually affect it come back so destroyed. And those become clients, don't they? They become part of the communities that we run into and address and attempt to heal in any way that we possibly can.
Well, some of them then end up mental problems, ill, homeless, poor.
Right. Killing their loved ones, drugged out, so on, yes. Okay, so things that, yes, is there?
I have another one.
You have another one? Okay.
Emotional people, emotional men and emotional women. I think in our society and culture, emotions are so maligned as baser instincts, and maybe if you're an artist, it's okay to express your emotions, but otherwise.
That's why I have always loved being an artist.
Yeah.
Sometimes go a little further and call myself a crazy artist. Don't know what I'm going to say. I might do all kinds of things, but I'm not going to keep a stiff upper lip unless I want to.
But even with artists, like Judy said earlier, artists don't get respect until after they die.
That's
Yeah.
You pay a little price for that. You pay a tiny price for that, but
Well,
yes.
at least you get some respect at all, right? Because some people just don't live, never get any. So.
That's right. That's right. I am not complaining at all, but yes, emotional or expressive. Emotional, expressive. So how can we imagine using stories, and especially I'm talking origin stories, which has of course a big definition. It can be everything, but it frequently does go back to the Eve story, for example, or it goes back to some story about Superman, or it goes back to these big underlying, in a way you can say, creation myths that
Big
we
Bang.
live in all the time. Someone said something?
I just said Big Bang.
Big Bang, right. Yes, I mean, there are many of them. How do we work with those as healers? Yes?
So, I've recently been reading a dissertation called Third Gender. And so it's exploring, third gender, transgender, transsexual groups. And one of the things that I thought was just so amazing in one of the sort of little vignettes, there was, I can't remember if the person was switching from female to male or male to female, but either way, they were making a switch from one biological sex to another biological sex. And one of the ways they did that is they engaged ritual. And I thought, how rich of a way to initiate, to sort of allow one part of the self to die, or one origin self, one origin story of, like, say for myself, like, I'm biologically born a female, so that has an origin story within itself.
Right.
And switching over to a male, allowing that origin story of me being a biological female to die and rebirthing through ritual a new origin story of being a biological male. I thought, oh my God, I mean, I was like, sticky notes, what an amazing way to create a new origin story.
To recreate yourself. in
Right.
some way.
Right, so through ritual.
Yeah, through ritual. Okay, let's start another list then of things that we know work to redo the story. And I'm going to put poetry up here, because poets rule the world. And don't ever forget this. If you learn nothing else today, learn this. Poets rule the world. That's because poets, the whole word poet means make, to make. And these stories frequently were put in place by poets who, of course, as the cartoon said, these guys are chipping rules into stone and saying, of course, no one was ever going to take this literally. Surprise. So, ritual, a big one, a really big one, and it's, it's what is happening with, it's what happens when people engage in psychotherapy, isn't it? That is a ritual itself, just as writing is a ritual. But that's a ritual of transformation, or when people engage with a dissertation or a thesis process, they're literally writing themselves and researching themselves into a new story that they didn't know before, because you learn something by doing it. Isn't that right? So just that very act of going to school and going through the ritual that school is, and the, oh my gosh, these rules, and oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to stand in this after I finish it. But it's very transforming, and that kind, very life transforming, as some of us can testify. Yeah. So, okay, something else?
That makes me just think about just research. To research my origin story, to research my ancestors, to research what I did or didn't know or was told or believed or didn't, but to research myself.
Like autoethnography?
Research in its broadest extent, yeah, is a way that I redefine my origin story.
Yeah.
It's by doing the work myself.
Self, and then also, and more, self and more than self. I mean, really, to be, how many of us are from families that have mental illness in them? And that engagement, doesn't it draw you to spiritual things? Don't you find that there's a thinner veil for you between what's hardcore reality and what's really ephemeral, or maybe it's messages, or maybe it's animals really are talking to me, or maybe it's plants really are conscious, so maybe that dream really is precogging, but just happened afterwards. That we're more keenly aware of that, would you say? I would say that. Keenly aware of that, and of trying to discern what is the difference between being mentally ill and being mentally visionary or accepting or permeable in some way, permeable membrane of self that can allow disparate kinds of energies to come in and find, an aesthetic in that.
You know what, when you said about mental illness, what came up for me is the first question they ask someone, do you hear voices?
Mm-hmm.
Something's wrong if you don't hear voices.
So, the more is a spiritual more, right? Spirituality that can be researched, that hasn't been researched enough, can be researched more. Okay, we've got 4 minutes. Hayden?
Oh, I also think there's in retelling my own story, which is going through the dissertation, what I did, there's a level of self-choice. On the research of self, then I get to see all of the components, or at least the components I can see of my story. And then I get to choose the pieces that I then make part of my identity.
Right.
So I could choose to continue to tell a story about this one incident that happened to me when I was 12 years old.
Ad nauseum.
Ad nauseum. Or I could choose other moments of my life, of which there are millions and thousands of them.
Yeah. This is what I'm grappling with in my memoir. Why are all my stories so sad? One after another. What am I going to do? Where's my humor? Challenge. Okay, yeah.
Just because we're here, I have to say it. It seems to me that that's what transpersonal psychology is doing.
Yeah.
Is really saying, you know what, there's a different story.
Yes.
We can, as Courtney was saying, that re-explaining things is social action, and that by re-explaining who we are, what the psyche is, just as you were saying, what different kinds of things that are called mental illness are, by redefining them, we are creating a new kind of origin story.
Yes, we are. Yeah, we are, and that's what keeps me optimistic. Is that. So I'm going to put TP right here. Okay, and that's our final thing. One minute we have, like. So
why don't we use our minute to thank you?
Yes.